In the frozen heart of Petrograd during the winter of 1917, the capital of the Russian Empire stood as a city suspended between two worlds, where the icy wind carried the faint echo of marching boots and distant factory whistles that had grown irregular and strained. Snow blanketed the grand boulevards and the cramped worker districts alike, muffling the usual clamor of horse-drawn carriages and street vendors. Yet beneath that white silence stirred something deeper, a tension that no one yet dared name aloud. The mighty Romanov dynasty, which had ruled this sprawling empire for over 3 centuries, appeared unshaken on the surface, its palaces glowing with candlelight and its armies still locked in the carnage of the Great War. But the collapse did not announce itself with fanfare or sudden violence. It crept forward in the empty bread shops, in the hollow eyes of mothers clutching ration cards, and in the growing distance between the Tsar's distant decisions and the daily suffering of his subjects. Few could imagine that this ancient autocracy, vast as the Siberian steppes and rigid as its iron-fisted traditions, was already unraveling from within, thread by thread, until the fabric would tear beyond repair. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with unspoken questions about loyalty, survival, and the invisible forces gathering just beyond the horizon. The Russian Empire at the dawn of the 20th century stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, a colossus of ethnic diversity and feudal tradition that had resisted the modernizing tides sweeping Western Europe. Under Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, the realm clung to its absolute monarchy with a quiet desperation, where the Tsar was seen not merely as ruler, but as the divinely ordained father of all Russians. Factories had begun to rise in the cities, railways snaked across the plains, and oil fields in the Caucasus produced wealth for a fortunate few, yet the vast majority of the population, some 80%, remained tied to the land in ways little changed since the days of serfdom. The emancipation of 1861 had freed the peasants from bondage, but it left them shackled to village communes and crippling redemption payments, their wooden izbas clustered around muddy fields that yielded barely enough to feed growing families. In the glittering salons of St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd to shed its German-sounding name, nobles in tailored uniforms toasted the empire's glory, while ignoring the creaking foundations beneath their polished boots. The empire's multi-ethnic tapestry, from Poles in the west to Tatars in the east, simmered with quiet resentments under Russian dominance, but for now the Tsar's portrait still hung in every school and barracks, a symbol of continuity that masked the gathering storm. Daily life in Tsarist Russia unfolded in stark contrasts that defined the empire's fragile balance before the rupture. In the countryside, peasants rose before dawn to the lowing of cows and the scrape of wooden plows through frost-hardened soil, their lives measured by the seasons and the demands of the mir, the village assembly that dictated planting and harvesting. Children played in the dirt outside thatched huts, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic thud of axes splitting firewood, while elders recounted tales of past harvests and distant wars around flickering samovars. Hunger was a constant companion, infant mortality shockingly high, and the soil, exhausted by outdated methods, offered little mercy. In the growing industrial centers, workers crammed into barracks after 12-hour shifts in textile mills and steel foundries, the air thick with coal dust and the clang of machinery that promised progress but delivered only exhaustion and low wages. Women and children labored alongside men, their hands raw from looms and furnaces, returning to shared rooms where the smell of cabbage soup and unwashed bodies lingered long into the night. Meanwhile, the nobility and bourgeoisie strolled the Nevsky Prospect in furs and top hats, attending operas and balls where crystal chandeliers reflected the opulence of a world that felt increasingly detached from the realities outside the palace gates. This rhythm of existence, routine yet strained, masked the early fractures that no official decree or imperial edict could fully conceal. Early warning signs of instability appeared like faint cracks in the empire's grand facade, often dismissed by those in power as temporary disturbances rather than harbingers of systemic failure. The humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 shattered illusions of military invincibility, exposing the backwardness of supply lines and command structures that left thousands dead on distant battlefields. Then came Bloody Sunday in January 1905, when peaceful petitioners carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar approached the Winter Palace only to be met with volleys of rifle fire from imperial troops, their blood staining the snow as screams echoed across the square. Strikes rippled through factories, peasants burned manor houses in sporadic revolts, and even sailors mutinied aboard the battleship Potemkin, their cries for bread and justice briefly uniting disparate grievances. Nicholas II responded with the October Manifesto, promising a constitution and a Duma parliament, yet these concessions proved half-hearted. The assembly repeatedly dissolved when it challenged autocratic will. The empire's ethnic minorities grew restless under Russification policies, their languages and traditions suppressed, while intellectuals debated Western ideas in smoke-filled cafes, unaware that the seeds of discontent were taking root far deeper than any political reform could reach. Still, the surface calm returned, the factories resumed their hum, and the fields were tilled once more, but the invisible warnings lingered, waiting for the right pressure to widen the fissures. As industrialization accelerated unevenly across the empire, rising tension and instability began to erode the old social order in ways that were subtle yet profound. New railways and factories drew peasants from their villages into urban slums, creating a restless proletariat exposed to radical pamphlets smuggled from abroad and whispered discussions of socialism that promised dignity denied by the Tsar's regime. Wages remained pitiful, hours grueling, and living conditions squalid, fueling sporadic strikes that authorities crushed with Cossack whips and arrests. In the countryside, land hunger persisted despite reforms by Prime Minister Stolypin, who encouraged enterprising peasants to break from the communes, yet most remained trapped in poverty, their resentment simmering as noble estates sprawled untouched nearby. The nobility itself showed cracks, with some younger aristocrats questioning the autocracy in private salons, while the Orthodox Church, once a pillar of loyalty, struggled to maintain influence amid growing secular doubts. Ethnic tensions flared in border regions, where Poles, Finns, and Ukrainians chafed under centralized rule from Petrograd. The empire's economy, though expanding, depended heavily on foreign loans and grain exports that left domestic tables bare during poor harvests. Daily routines continued, the creak of ox carts and the ring of blacksmith hammers, but an undercurrent of unease spread like frost on window panes, a quiet anticipation that something fundamental was shifting beneath the empire's gilded exterior. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 initially masked these fractures with a surge of patriotic fervor as crowds cheered the Tsar's declaration against Germany and Austria-Hungary, banners waving and church bells ringing across the land. Millions of peasants in gray uniforms marched to the front, their boots thudding along dusty roads, believing they fought for Holy Russia and the Little Father in Petrograd. Yet the conflict quickly exposed the empire's fatal weaknesses, with poorly equipped troops facing modern German artillery and machine guns, leading to catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, where entire armies vanished in the mud and blood of East Prussia. Casualties mounted into the millions, supply lines collapsed under the strain of vast distances, and the home front groaned under the weight of requisitioned horses and grain. Inflation spiraled as the government printed money to fund the war, turning bread into a luxury and fuel into a memory in the cities. Factories shifted to munitions but suffered from raw material shortages and labor disruptions, while refugees from occupied western provinces flooded eastward, straining already overburdened resources. The initial unity fractured as soldiers in the trenches shared stories of incompetence and suffering, their letters home carrying seeds of doubt that would soon bloom into open discontent. The war, meant to strengthen the empire, instead accelerated the erosion of trust and the very institutions that had defined Russian life for generations. Key decisions and mounting pressures compounded the instability as Tsar Nicholas II, convinced of his divine duty, chose to take personal command of the army in 1915, leaving the capital in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra. This move, intended to rally the troops and restore morale, instead tied the monarchy directly to every battlefield failure, as Nicholas's limited military experience proved no match for the strategic demands of total war. In Petrograd, Alexandra, of German birth and already viewed with suspicion, relied heavily on the enigmatic mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the imperial family stemmed from his apparent ability to ease the suffering of the hemophiliac heir, Tsarevich Alexei. Rumors swirled through the salons and barracks of Rasputin's drunken debauchery and political meddling, his appointments of incompetent ministers fueling whispers of treason and corruption at the highest levels. The Duma, when convened, voiced growing frustration through the progressive bloc, demanding a government of public confidence, only to face prorogation and dismissal. Economic pressures intensified with food shortages and transport breakdowns, as railways prioritized military needs over civilian supply, leaving markets empty and queues lengthening in the snow. Strikes erupted more frequently, soldiers at the front began to desert in small but telling numbers, and the once unquestioned loyalty of the peasantry wavered as letters from the trenches described horrors that no official communique could hide. The empire's rigid structure, designed for obedience rather than adaptation, buckled under the cumulative weight of these choices and external demands. By late 1916, the invisible pressures had built to a breaking point, yet the imperial court remained insulated in its routines of balls and religious observances, blind to the gathering storm. Rasputin's assassination by noble conspirators in December offered a momentary illusion of relief, but it only underscored the monarchy's isolation and the desperation among even the elite. In the factories and barracks, discontent crystallized into organized murmurs of revolt, while peasants in the villages hoarded what little grain remained, refusing to sell at fixed prices that benefited the state over their starving families. The cold of that winter felt harsher, the silence in the streets more ominous, as Petrograd's workers faced breadlines that stretched for blocks and rations that dwindled to almost nothing. Nicholas, still at the front, received reports of unrest but dismissed them as the work of agitators, his faith in divine providence unshaken. The system that had endured centuries of invasion and reform now faced an internal corrosion no decree could arrest. Daily life, once predictable in its hardships, had become a daily gamble for survival, with the fear of tomorrow etched into every conversation and every shadowed glance. The collapse did not arrive with a single decree or battle. It had been building quietly and visibly until the moment when the accumulated strains would finally snap the empire's fragile spine. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with grand proclamations, but with the ordinary desperation of women queuing for bread on February 23, 1917, International Women's Day, when strikes in Petrograd's textile mills spilled into the streets and swelled into mass demonstrations. The cold was biting, the snow turning to slush under thousands of feet as chants of bread, mixed with calls against the war and the autocracy. Factories emptied, trams halted, and the crowd grew into a human tide that authorities could no longer contain with police batons alone. By the following day, over 200,000 workers had joined the protests, their voices echoing off the stone facades of government buildings as soldiers watched from barracks windows, their loyalty to the Tsar wavering under the weight of shared suffering. Nicholas, hundreds of miles away, ordered the unrest suppressed by force, but the troops, many of them recent conscripts from the same peasant stock as the demonstrators, began to fraternize instead of firing. The Duma, prorogued once more, defied the order and formed a provisional committee, while the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' deputies emerged as a parallel power in the capital. The once unassailable pillars of autocracy, the army, the police, and the bureaucracy crumbled with astonishing speed as telegraph lines carried news of mutiny and abdication rumors across the empire. What had seemed an unbreakable order dissolved into confusion and opportunity, the quiet warnings of years past now exploding into open rupture. Human consequences of this systemic failure spread rapidly across the empire, transforming abstract discontent into raw, visceral suffering and upheaval that touched every corner of Russian life. In Petrograd, the streets filled with armed soldiers who had turned their rifles over to the crowds, their faces gaunt from months of frontline deprivation, while food riots emptied shops and set warehouses ablaze. Peasants in distant villages, hearing of the Tsar's weakening grip, began seizing noble lands, torching manor houses in a wave of spontaneous retribution that echoed the unrest of 1905, but on a far greater scale. Families fractured as deserters returned home to find wives and children weakened by hunger, their stories of battlefield horror fueling further resentment against the old order. The nobility, once secure in their estates, now faced the terror of approaching mobs, their servants fleeing or joining the revolt, while in the cities the middle classes watched in horror as order gave way to improvised committees and revolutionary tribunals. The silence that once hung over winter nights was replaced by the constant murmur of meetings, the crackle of bonfires, and the distant rattle of gunfire as rival factions clashed. Fear became a daily companion, etched into the hurried footsteps of those seeking safety and the hollow stares of those who had lost everything. The empire's social fabric, already frayed, tore apart in a cascade of personal tragedies that no one had fully anticipated when the first strikes began. Social breakdown accelerated as the Tsar's abdication on March 2, 1917, formally ended 300 years of Romanov rule, leaving a vacuum that the provisional government struggled to fill amid competing demands from workers, Soviets, and military councils. Soldiers deserted en masse, streaming homeward in ragged columns, their discipline shattered by promises of land and peace that the new authorities could not yet deliver. In the countryside, entire provinces descended into chaos as land seizures turned violent, with reports of manor burnings and noble families fleeing to the cities or abroad. Factories ground to a halt under worker control experiments, production plummeting as discipline evaporated and raw materials grew scarce. Ethnic groups in the borderlands asserted greater autonomy, adding layers of fragmentation to an already collapsing state. The once familiar routines of village life and factory shifts dissolved into improvised assemblies where debates raged late into the night, fueled by exhaustion and newfound hope mixed with dread. Hunger persisted, now compounded by disrupted supply chains and the absence of central authority, turning markets into battlegrounds of barter and theft. The human cost was immense, measured not only in lives lost to violence but in the quiet despair of families torn apart, traditions upended, and a society forced to reinvent itself in the shadow of irreversible loss. The long-term historical impact of this collapse reshaped not only Russia, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century, as the fall of the autocracy created the conditions for radical forces to seize the stage in ways that would echo across continents. The provisional government's inability to end the war or redistribute land swiftly eroded its legitimacy, paving the way for more decisive voices to promise bread, peace, and power to the Soviets. What began as a spontaneous outpouring against Tsarist incompetence evolved into a laboratory for new ideologies, where the old empire's ruins became the foundation for experiments in governance that no previous generation could have envisioned. The Romanov family, once symbols of divine right, faced exile and eventual tragedy, their palaces repurposed as museums to a vanished era. Economically, the empire's backwardness, exposed and exacerbated by war, left a legacy of industrial disarray that future regimes would inherit and attempt to overcome through drastic measures. Socially, the rupture liberated long-suppressed aspirations among peasants and workers, while unleashing cycles of violence and retribution that scarred generations. Globally, the events signaled the end of one era of imperial dominance and the dawn of ideological confrontations that would define alliances and conflicts for decades. The collapse, though rooted in Russia's unique conditions, served as a stark reminder of how internal weaknesses, ignored too long, could unravel even the mightiest structures. Yet even as the old order crumbled, the reflective weight of what had been lost lingered in the collective memory of a nation forever altered by the choices and oversights of its final imperial years. The vast steppes, once tilled under the Tsar's distant gaze, now witnessed a different kind of sowing, one of uncertainty and reinvention, where the sounds of revolution replaced the quiet rhythms of feudal life. The palaces that had hosted glittering balls stood empty or repurposed, their chandeliers dark, echoing with the ghosts of decisions that had seemed prudent at the time, but proved fatal in hindsight. Families carried forward stories of survival amid the breadlines and mutinies, passing down lessons about the fragility of power and the unpredictable consequences of neglect. The empire's collapse had not been a single cataclysm but a slow accumulation of invisible fractures, each one widening until the entire edifice gave way. In the end, the Russia that emerged from those frozen February days bore little resemblance to the one that had entered the war with such misplaced confidence, its people forever marked by the human cost of a system that had failed to heed its own quiet warnings. The rupture reshaped civilizations far beyond its borders, leaving a haunting legacy of both liberation and unimaginable cost, a testament to how empires built on unyielding tradition can dissolve when the ground beneath them shifts, unnoticed.